You are at episode number 137. It's kind of hard to believe, a brand new podcast. Well, brand new would not be the right word to say, but we're at episode number 137. Of course, we do three a week, so that means we do 156 a year. So that doesn't take long to get up to that number. And as you heard in the bumper coming in, as the lady who provides all that great information about our sponsor, Cheney and Associates out of California, is now our sponsor for 2024 for the Church Answers podcast. And you're going to hear me talk about them more. We've had a great relationship with them for a few years. And when the opportunity came for them to be the exclusive sponsor of the Church Answers podcast, I jumped at it to go for them. They jumped at it and responded. And boy, if you have any type of bookkeeping, accounting need in your church, check out Cheney and Associates. Our guest today, if you listen to the previous podcast, man, it was rich. It just had so much. Dr. Eddie Moody, the executive director of the National Association of Free Will Baptists. Eddie, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Thom. I appreciate it.
Well, I wasn't going to ban you after the first one because the first one was really, really good. And some of the things that you said were, boy, I just wish I had had this kind of resource when I was a pastor. And I know a lot of my church members wish I had had this kind of resource when I was a pastor. You know, going way back, I think this was in 1993 in a church. I dealt for the first time with one of my church members who had AIDS when it was the scourge, if you will. It was the scary disease at the time. And boy, and he ended up dying. And I just did not know what to do, for all of that. And I did my best, and I listened to him and I listened to his parents, but I could have done a whole lot better. But we're talking about the first aid kit. We're talking about this new book that Eddie has. We have the links in it. You explained it last time, Eddie, but just give the audience a little bit of overview of the reason behind this book. I thought that was powerful in what you said in the previous episode.
So I used to work as a staff psychologist in a correctional institute, which really was an hour and a half from where I was going to school at NC State University. So I would think about this. I was being kind of hammered by other Christians about what do we do to help folks, and really going back and forth to that particular correctional institute. I outlined what you see as the original book, First Aid for Emotional Hurts, and just trying to make it as simple, as concise as possible for just regular Christians to be able to help folks in need. We're the hands and feet of Christ. We're the ambassador, and Christ ambassador to others. And he's told people, if you're hurting, come to me. We're the ones that do that. So it's just an attempt to try to help our people, God's people, to help other people through difficult times.
We talked about some of the individual needs in the first episode that we did with you, and we talked about depression or potential suicide. We talked about some of the issues that individuals have, and I don't want to get away from those, but let's talk about the church ministering to the community at large. One of the things that I know that you are very much in tune with is the church's community, because your churches among the Free Will Baptists, a lot of them use our Know Your Community report. And I know that's just your heart. You want them to know their community so that they can minister and reach their community.
Absolutely. So I think we're up to maybe 14 or 15% of all of our churches have done a Know Your Community report. And we really use this. So we work with them. And first off, we ask, how many widows do you have? So we're looking at that. We actually have a database where every church that has participated in Know Your Community, they can see how many other churches have. And so when we use the Know Your Community report, we know there's some big issues in each particular community to focus on. And so widows is one. The other thing, we did this about a year ago, Thom, where we looked at what was the number one demographic group, and it was particularly females 60 to 64. And so whatever it would be, we ask a church to look at, if your number one group is females 60 to 64, what do they need? And often they're being widowed, often they're about to retire. And so we ask churches to look specifically at what they might do to minister to that particular population. And so often we're saying you need to get good at widow care because it's there. And with Know Your Community, they make an estimate of what you expect to see in the next 5 years. So you can see if that intervention will have legs, so to speak, because it's there. Another thing we do with the Know Your Community report is look at the cohabiting that happens, both same sex and opposite sex. And so if a church has a community that's got a whole lot of opposite sex cohabitation, sometimes we're just putting a little emphasis out there about trying to work with people. If you're interested in getting married, we do premarital with you. That's a bit of a way to help them. And then, there's a lot of information about financials. So is that something that we can help them with, getting our people out of debt and helping them to use their money better? The other thing we do is, all about the psychographics is some of these groups are all into do-it-yourself projects. And so we'll try to get, like, if you've got a group that's into do-it-yourself projects, to adopt, hey, every time somebody gets widowed, we're going to try to be alert to things they may have or needs they may have. Got a lot of disability in your community. We're going to get good at setting up these little ramps. And we find that's just a good way for churches to be able to minister to needs in their community and help them reach the community, actually.
Wow. That, my friend, that response was worth all of the podcasts that we're doing, just to hear how you're finding out the community needs. I'll give a plug right now. Son Art just released, as of this recording, yesterday, the 7 money milestones. And he's had a lot of people come to say that they're going to use that. So you talked about the financial needs. I'm just mentioning that his is one. And Alana, I will ask you to just, if y'all don't see Alana, she's the editor, production, and all the behind the scenes of this. I'm going to ask Alana to put that in the show notes as well. So we got, you're learning what the community is, Eddie, and you're learning how to, or maybe you're trying to work with the churches to talk to them about how they can minister and how they can reach. You are one of the most prolific users of the Know Your Community report. Can you give me a story or two that you've heard? It doesn't have to, or it could be a trend or just anything that you've heard of people as they begin to find out about their community more.
So there's one, and we've got a little podcast out there with it, the Locklears up in Michigan. And so they did Know Your Community. They realize there's a lot of people that want to exercise. And Stephanie Locklear in particular, the pastor's wife, is like, I want to reach people. I want to reach them with the gospel. And so she's doing things like trying to exercise because that's one of the things she liked to do. Well, the exercise place gets shut down. So they're like, hey, come to our church. This is in Woodhaven, or it's Woodhaven Free Will Baptist Church outside of Detroit. And so they start having the exercise place there at the church. So she's using, she and her husband, Jonathan, and another pastor, Lloyd, who is the senior pastor there, they start allowing this to happen on the campus. Well, as they go along, one of the ladies in the group's child dies. Oh. So the lady was not part of the church. Some of the people become part of the church, some do not. It's just a way of them reaching out. But the church becomes the avenue to minister to this woman and her family after the child dies. Wow. So it's a way of all of this kind of coming full circle. You learned a bit about the community, the interest in exercise and all the rest of it, brought it into the church. You're trying to get them in the church, trying to invite them, teach them about Christ and so forth. But then we have a tragic situation, and the church is the one coming around this woman and ministering to her, which the others end up, in being influenced about that a little bit. And so for us, Tom, we're just pushing people to think a bit about, I need an entryway into my community. And when I get that entryway into my community, then things happen. And we talk about the first aid part being first aid ready. When things happen, I'm ready and I'm prepared. I'm prepared to do that. Another thing we're doing right now is we're trying to get folks to think about dementia, right? Because it's the silver tsunami, and we can see that in our churches that the communities struggle there with that. So we're trying to get them to think about, could we do like a daycare where people can bring a spouse or a parent that's got dementia, give them a 4-hour break,
Mm.
and so forth. And then that creates opportunities for the gospel too. So we're just trying to get them to think about that a bit. We know from data, I know you know about the study that Barna put out last May about non-believers looking at the church and thinking the church should have answers for this. And so we're
Mm.
trying to get churches to think about, what could I do to reach my community, but also what could I do to minister to it? And this is something the community is saying, hey, we want you to help us with that.
Wow.
I got another story to think about, and this comes a couple that came to our church when I was pastoring. I looked on their communication card one Sunday as I left, and they put on there, Jesus sent us to this church. And I'm like, whoa, buddy. So I follow up with them, and I learned that their child had been killed in an accident.
Mm.
And so they came into the church. The people were friendly with them. Nobody said anything like, well, you're in my seat and all that business. It was not a cold feel.
Yeah.
And so they felt, nobody knew them. Nobody knew anything about what happened to them, but they felt the presence of Jesus, they said. And so we've got to know, when people are hurting, they look to the church. They may have never thought about church before, but they look to the church.
Wow.
And so you think about your stuff with being a welcoming church, all that's real critical, because people coming up and speaking to them kind of helps them and everything. Now, that couple, they came to church, they felt at home, and then they were all in. They just kept coming. And then they would say things about what happened. They would talk about their son, and people just nicely listened to them. And the more they talked about that, the better they got. The husband gets involved in the music ministry. He's starting to know people more intimately. And there are some people that probably looked and said, these people are getting too involved in the church. They're going to burn themselves out, that didn't know what had happened to them. But that's what they needed at that time. So the church is really the answer. And so we want the church to somehow interact with their community a little bit. And then these things happen, which allow them to be the hands and feet, if you will, of Christ.
Incredible stories. Once again, we're talking to Dr. Eddie Moody, the Executive Director of the National Association of Free Will Baptists. We're talking about his book, and it's this first aid kit for churches, and you'll see that in the show notes. You mentioned your podcast. What's the name of it?
It's Better Together, the Better Together podcast. And they could hear that story if they go to Better Together and search Jonathan Locklear or Know Your Community, and they'll pick it up.
Okay, we'll put that. We'll put the name of the podcast in the show notes, and they can find that. We got one more podcast for those of you who are listeners or viewing on YouTube. We did the first one, and we were just looking at the overall individual needs. This one, we're talking about the community as a whole. Now, I want us to really look at this book, because this is an incredible resource for pastors, for church members, to help people like Thom Rainer, who doesn't know what to do when a hurting person comes to him. So we'll be talking about that more. Eddie, thank you for doing 3 of these. You got one more. We'll be happy and excited to see you be a part of it. Thank you, audience, as always, for being a part of the Church Answers podcast. We are grateful that you are here. Would you give us a rating, a review, subscribe at YouTube, whatever you need to do. We like for more people to come here, because we're providing a ministry, and we want to provide this ministry free of charge to all of our listeners and all of our viewers. So we would appreciate you doing that. Stay tuned for the next podcast, again, sponsored by Cheney and Associates, as we continue to look at this incredible resource, the first aid kit that Eddie Moody is going to be talking about in detail. We'll see you in the next episode.